Planned and mixed economy. Independent India was declared to be a planned and a mixed economy. India needed national planning. It was decided by the political leadership almost a decade before independence. 14 India was not only facing regional disparities at the level of resources but inter-regional disparities were also prevalent, since centuries. Mass poverty could only be remedied once the government started the process of economic planning. Economic planning was thus considered an established tool of doing away with such disparities. Basically, it was the abject poverty of the masses which made the government go for planning so that it could play an active role in the allocation of resources and mobilize them for an equitable growth and development. Though India was constitutionally declared a federation of states, in the process of planning, the authority of regulation, directing and undertaking economic activities got more and more centralized in the Union government. 15. India's decision for a planned economy was also molded by some contemporary experiences in the world. 16. Firstly, the Great Depression of 1929 and the reconstruction challenges after the Second World War had made experts to conclude in favor of a state intervention in the economy, opposite to the contemporary idea of non-interference, as proposed by Adam Smith. Secondly, it was the same time that the command economies, i.e., state economies, of the Soviet Union and the East European countries started making news about their faster economic growth. In the 1950s and 1960s, the dominant view among the policymakers around the world was in favor of an active role of the state in the economy. Thirdly, a dominant role for the state in the economy to neutralize market failure situations, as happened during the period of the Great Depression when demand fell down to the lowest levels, was gaining ground around the world. For many newly independent developing nations, economic planning was therefore an obvious choice. Economic planning was considered to help states to mobilize resources to realize the prioritized objectives in a well-defined time frame. Once the political leadership had decided in favor of a planned economy for India and a major role for the state in the economy, they needed to clarify about the organizational nature of the economy, whether it was to be a state economy or a mixed economy, because planning was not possible in a free market economy, i.e., capitalistic economy. The idea of planning in India was inspired from the Soviet planning, which was a command economy and did not suit the requirements of democratic India, which was till now a privately owned economy. 17. The dominant force behind planning in India, at least after independence, was Nehru himself, who had strong socialist leanings. He thought it very urgent to define the role of the state in the economy, which was going to be at times similar to the state in the Soviet Union and at times completely dissimilar to it. Though there was an example of a capitalistic democratic system going for planning, France by that time, 1947, it had little experience to offer the Indian policymakers. France had gone for a mixed economy by 1944-45. With the basic urge to accelerate the process of economic growth, the planners went to define the respective roles of the state and the market, in the very first plan itself. The following lines look refreshingly ahead of the times and crystal clear about the scope of the government's role in the economy vis-à-vis the private sector. This brings us to the problem of the techniques of planning. A possible approach to the problem is, as mentioned earlier, through a more or less complete nationalization of the means of production and extensive system of government controls on the allocation of resources and on the distribution of the national product. Judged purely as a technique of planning, this may appear a promising line of action. But, viewed against the background of the objectives outlined above, and in the light of practical consideration, such an expansion of the public sector is, at the present stage, neither necessary nor desirable. Planning in a democratic setup implies the minimum use of compulsion or coercion for bringing about a realignment of productive forces. The resources available to the public sector have, at this stage, to be utilized for investment along new lines rather than in acquisition of existing productive capacity. Public ownership of the means of production may be necessary in certain cases, public regulation and control in certain others. The private sector has, however, to continue to play an important part in production as well as in distribution. Planning under recent conditions thus means, in practice, an economy guided and directed by the state and operated partly through direct state action and partly through private initiative and effort. 18. The above quoted lines are imaginatively ahead of the times. It will be suitable to note here that as 1950s and 1960s made the world experts favor state intervention in the economy, the East Asian Miracle, WB, 19. of the coming 3 decades was going to define the very limits of such an intervention. The East Asian economies were able to sustain a high growth rate over 3 decades and had revived again the discussions regarding the respective roles of the state and the market as well as the nature of the state's role in the economy. The kind of conclusions drawn were very similar to the view presented in India's first plan itself, which was presented by the World Bank in 1993. The real nature of the Indian brand of mixed economy, though beautifully outlined in 1951 itself, went through a process of detailed evolution in the decade of the 1950s. By the end of the 1950s, the concept of the mixed economy was almost buried and rose from hibernation only by mid-1980s and finally early in 1990s in the wake of the process of economic reforms. The state market mix, i.e., the public sector and private sector, defined for India though, clearly delineated the nature of mixed economy. The vision was obviously blurred in the coming decades as part of economic mismanagement. The imagined mixed economy of India will become more clear in the next subtopic. Emphasis on the public sector. The state was to be given an active and dominant role in the economy. It was very much decided by the time India became independent. There were no doubts about it in the minds of the people who formed the dominant political force at the time. Naturally, there was going to be a giant structure of the government-controlled enterprises to be known as the public sector undertakings, PSUs. Criticism aside, there were at that time a strong logic behind the glorification of PSUs. Some of the reasons for heavy investments in the PSUs were 3.10 times Indian economy, purely natural, while others were consequential in nature. There were certain highly commendable objectives set for them. Some other goals would go on to serve the very soul of the mixed economy. We must go for an impartial and rational analysis of the matter, in the midst of all the criticism of PSUs and the contemporary moves of privatizing them, to understand their roles in the Indian economy. We may understand the reasons behind the ambitious expansion of the PSUs in the face of the following major requirements. 11. Infrastructural needs. Every economy, whether it is agrarian, industrial or post-industrial, needs suitable levels of infrastructure such as power, transportation and communication. Without their healthy presence and expansion, no economy can grow and develop. At the eve of independence, India was having almost no presence of these 3 basic requirements. There was just a beginning in the area of railways, and post and telegraph. Power was restricted to selective homes of government and the princely states. It means, even if India had opted for agriculture as its prime moving force, PMF, it had to develop the infrastructure sector. These sectors require too much capital investment as well as heavy engineering and technological support for their development. Expansion of the infrastructure sector was considered not possible by the private sector of the time, as they could possibly not manage the following components. I. Heavy investment, in domestic as well as foreign currencies. 2. Technology. 3. Skilled manpower. And 4. Entrepreneurship. Even if these inputs were available to the private sector, it was not feasible for them as there was no market for such infrastructure. These infrastructures were essential for the economy, but they needed either subsidized or almost free supply as the masses lacked the market-determined purchasing capacity. Under these typical conditions, it was only the government which could have shouldered the responsibility. The government could have managed not only the inputs required for the development of the sector but could also supply and distribute them to the needy areas and the consumers for the proper growth of the economy. There were no alternatives, and that is why the infrastructure sector in India has such a dominant state presence that many areas have obvious government monopolies, as in power, railways, aviation, telecommunication, etc. 2. Industrial needs. India had opted for the industrial sector as its prime moving force, as we saw in the earlier pages. Now there were some areas of industries which the government had to invest in, due to several compulsive reasons. For industrialization and its success, every economy needs the healthy presence of some basic industries, which are also known as the infrastructure industries. 21 There are 6 basic industries which every industrializing economy requires, namely I. Iron and steel, 2. Cement, 3. Coal, 4. Crude oil, V. Oil refining, and 6. Electricity. Note, at present, there are 8 core industries in India, with the base 2004-05 is equal to 100, 6 existing basic infrastructure industries with 2 new additions, i.e., natural gas and fertilizer. Core industries together have a combined weight of 37.90% in the Index of Industrial Production, IIP. Individual percentages of them are: coal, weight, 4.38%, crude oil, weight, 5.22%, natural gas, weight, 1.71%, petroleum refinery, weight, 5.94%, fertilizer, weight, 1.25%, steel, weight, 6.68%, cement, weight, 2.41%, and electricity, weight, 10.32%. Similar to the infrastructure sector, these basic industries also require high level of capital, technology, skilled manpower and articulation in entrepreneurship, which was again considered not feasible for the private sector of the time to manage. Even if the private sector supplied goods from the basic industries, they might not be able to sell their products in the market due to the lower purchasing power of the consumers. Perhaps, that is why again the responsibility of developing the basic industries was taken up by the government. Out of the 6 basic industries, the cement sector was having some strength in the private, and in iron and steel sector a lone private company was present. The coal sector was controlled by the private sector, and crude oil and refining was just a beginning by them. The level of demands of an industrializing India was never to be met by the existing strength of the basic industries. Neither the required level of expansion in them was possible by the existing number of private players. With no choice left, the government decided to play the main role in them. In many of them we as a result see a natural monopoly for the PSUs, again. 3. Employment generation. The PSUs were also seen as an important part of the employment generation strategy. A government in a democratic setup cannot think only economics, but it has to realize the socio-political dimensions of the nation too. The country was faced with the serious problem of poverty, and the workforce was increasing at a fast rate. Giving employment to the poor people is time-tested tool of poverty alleviation. The PSUs were thought to create enough jobs for the employable workforce of the economy. There was also felt an immediacy for a social change in the country. The poverty of a greater section of the country was somehow connected to the age-old caste system, which propitiated the stronghold of the upper castes on the ownership of land, which was the only means of income and livelihood for almost above 80% of the population. Along with the ambitious policy of land reforms, the government had decided to provide reservations to the weaker sections of the society in government jobs. The upcoming PSUs were supposed to put such jobs at the disposal of the government, which could have been distributed along the decided reservation policy. Such reservations were considered an economic tool for social change. In the highly capital-intensive sectors in which the government companies were going to enter, managing investable funds to set them up was not going to be an easy task. The government did manage the funds with sources like taxation, internal and external borrowing, and even taking last refuge in the printing of fresh currencies. The government went to justify the high taxation and heavy public indebtedness in supplying employment to the Indian employable population. The PSUs were considered by the government as the focus of the trickle-down effect. The government did everything to set up and run the PSUs as the benefits were supposed to percolate to the masses, finally reinforcing growth and development in the country. Employment in the PSUs was seen as the effort of the trickle-down theory, simply said. At a point of time, Nehru even mentioned the PSUs as the temples of modern India. The government went to commit even a 3.12 times Indian economy. Job in every household via the PSUs without calculating the dimensions of the future labor force in the country and the required resources to create jobs at such a high scale. But the government went on creating new PSUs without analyzing the fiscal repercussions, moreover believing them to be the real engine of equitable growth. The employment generation responsibility of the PSUs was extended to such an extent by the government that most of them had oversupply of the labor force, which started draining its profits on account of the salaries, wages, pensions and provident funds. The latter too had late financial impact. 4. Profit and development of the social sector. Times. The investment to be made by the government in PSUs was in the nature of asset creation, and these entities were to be involved in production activities. It was natural for the government to gain control over the profits and dividends accruing from them. The goods and services the PSUs were to produce and sell were going to provide disposable income to the government. The government had a conscious policy of spending the income generated by the PSUs. They were to be used in the supply of the social goods, or what is called the public goods. And thus, India was to have a developed social sector. By social goods the government meant the universal supply of certain goods and services to the Indian people. These included education, healthcare, nutrition, drinking water, social security, etc. in India. It means that the PSUs were also visioned as the revenue generators for the development of the social sector. Due to many reasons, the PSUs would not be able to generate as much profit as was required for the healthy development of the social sector. This eventually hampered the availability of public goods in the country. In place of giving profits back to the government, a large number of the PSUs started incurring huge losses and required budgetary supports as a regular phenomenon. Rise of the private sector. Times. As the PSUs will take the responsibility of supplying the infrastructure and the basic industries to the economy, a base for the rise of private sector industries will be built. With the rise of the private sector industries in the country, the process of industrialization will be completed. Out of the many roles the PSUs were supposed to play, this was the most far-sighted. Whatever happened to the different roles the PSUs were assigned is a totally different matter, to which we will return while discussing the industrial scenario in the country. Here we have analyzed why the government in India after independence went for such an ambitious plan of expansion of the public sector. Besides, the PSUs were aimed at many other connected areas of developmental concerns, such as self-sufficiency in production, balanced regional development, spread of small and ancillary industries, low and stable prices, and long-term equilibrium in balance of payment. Over time the PSUs have played a critical role in promoting the growth and development of the country.